We contend that there is a line to be drawn from USAID's creation in, I think, 1961 to the pop culture contrarian complaining about movies in 2023.
When taxpayer dollars of any quantity are being used to influence the American people, something against their will, that's not their agenda, then that's tyranny.
Independent media is not actually independent at all, but a faction of this whole organization that's sent out to make sure, hey, this is the narrative we want out. And we've all seen the videos of like every news media organization literally verbatim saying the same thing about some news story. You start to go, wait a second.
Any left-leaning organization is going to be talking about the constitutional crisis in America right now surrounding DOGE and all this stuff.
Yes, the bureaucratic crisis.
Yeah.
The deep state crisis.
Right. Hello, and welcome to the Pop Culture Contrarian with Thomas, Sterling, and Andrew.
Hello.
Hey, guys.
Our topic today is USAID is not about aid.
You don't say.
Even though it seems to be in the name.
Even though they want you to think that. It's not true. Before we start, make sure to like and subscribe and hit the bell icon on YouTube. And, make sure you see whenever we upload a new video. Leave us a comment. Let us know what you think, what you want us to talk about. Last week, we recorded something that hasn't gone out yet that subscriber recommended we talk about. So you do have an impact in what our podcasts end up being about. So be sure to contribute. We love that. All right, let's get started on USAID, guys. So I think kind of the thesis from our planning session is that USAID is meant to make you think it's about charitable giving. That's what you're meant to think. That's not what it is. And in fact, what it is, among many other things, because it's tied up in all sorts of stuff, but among many other things is it's one of the things that is one of the organizations that has been pushing leftist and even sometimes woke ideology that we have been reacting against. So we contend that there is a line to be drawn from USAID's creation in, I think, 1961. I have it somewhere.
Right, 61.
Yeah.
61.
Kennedy.
There's a line from that to the pop culture contrarian complaining about movies in 2023.
I've come to a conclusion, Inspector.
Yeah. Remarkably, because essentially it is an organization of supposedly international influence in nation building or destabilizing.
Yes. And it certainly has international influence. The scandal is that it has a great deal of national influence.
Right.
Yeah.
All right. So that's kind of the thesis. Let's dig in. This is going to be kind of free flowing because there's so much here. This is a big topic.
The best are free flowing.
Yes. Yeah. So, okay. Way back in 1961, John F. Kennedy establishes the USAID via executive order.
Yeah, and it's under the State Department at that point.
Yeah. This is how the Cold War.
Yeah. And let's see what Grok said. It was consolidating several assistance programs into one agency. The goal was to counter Soviet influence during the Cold War and promote U.S. soft power through socioeconomic development. So
reasonable
at that time, still misleading.
Yeah.
These were aid programs that kind of got folded into this, but the goal isn't humanitarian. The goal is make sure that there are people in Belarus saying what we want about America.
Well,
maybe not Belarus.
Yeah.
But
I mean, and to be fair, you're in a contest for global dominance.
Sure.
Yeah.
The whole communist Russia, Soviet Union, and China had become communist at this point too, obviously. There was the worldview vision of communism was, in order for it to fully work, the entirety of the globe needed to become communist.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And so this was an epic clash of worldviews where you have the liberal-minded, in the good sense, liberty-minded maybe, West versus the totalitarian, communist-minded East.
Yeah.
And they're kind of smashing up against each other. And so Kennedy was countering operations by the Soviet Union, who were trying to run these influence campaigns suggesting that the Soviet way was better than the way of the West and liberty.
Yeah.
So in just a basic nutshell, that's what you could.
Yeah. And I guess kind of to steelman that position and why USAID is good from that point of view, you could say, well, we spent however many millions in Indonesia promoting this, stupid TV show, but that TV show promotes American values, and now we don't have to go fight a war in Indonesia.
Right. Yeah, I think it's important to remember this is like one of the early examples of next generation warfare, which is economic, social, psychological, in the face of otherwise thermonuclear war, which we were trying to avoid.
We're in favor of that.
Yeah.
Personally, me, I'll go out on a limb here and say I'm against nuclear annihilation.
Yeah, same.
Okay, so USAID, of course, like all government organizations, lived well beyond its purpose because the Cold War, I don't know if you heard this, it ended in 1989 or 1991 or 92, whenever you want to date it to. But regardless, it did, in fact, end, and USAID did not.
Yeah, as is true with many of these organizations, as it were.
Yeah. So among a lot of other things that happened throughout its history, because, there's been a lot of decades from here to there, under Clinton in 98, I guess, it was USAID was kind of consolidated under the guidance of the Secretary of State, but still it was established to be independent.
Yeah. The Foreign Assistance Act of 1998 was passed. So this is an interesting move, and I don't know the history surrounding it well enough to know whether or not the motivations for this move were innocent. I kind of doubt it, but it made it more of an independent agency. Yep. So in so doing, it lacks the oversight of accountability, you could say, and that, I guess you could say maybe you could point to this and say this is where the USAID really lost this way. Yeah, maybe.
We don't know.
We're not sure.
I think Elon described it as this isn't apple with a worm in it. It's a ball full of worms. There's just nothing good left is how Elon described it when he got to it. We haven't even gotten there yet. But
right. Another way, at least describing it for what it is today, Representative Mark Green from Tennessee, actually, I saw him in a hearing. He described it basically as an unapologetic front for a far left agenda.
Well, that gets us maybe to the website.
Right. Yeah.
So there's a lot more history, obviously, and we're touching on only the barest details. But of course, the big controversy right now is DOGE is trying to, and seemingly has, shut down USAID. So their website is no longer available. But what we do have is the Wayback Machine, which can let us see their website from before it shut down. So here it is from January 18th of this year, so just a month ago. The United States Agency for International Development is the U.S. government agency that leads international development and humanitarian assistance efforts to partner countries. Okay, that sounds pretty good.
It's their cover.
That's their cover. But then let's scroll over to their budget justification tab. And just reading the things their budget is going to makes you go, I don't know if I, a conservative, feel represented by how the American people are exercising their influence abroad. So lots of things here, but first off, $10 billion in humanitarian assistance, including ongoing emergencies in Sudan, Afghanistan, Haiti, the Middle East, and other places as they emerge. Okay, again, that seems pretty reasonable. $2 billion for support to the people of the Middle East. Which people, I might ask, and especially after October 7th, I say, is it going to Hamas?
Yeah. And even further back, especially considering the Afghanistan withdrawal. And all the crap we left there.
Right. Are we sending money to the Taliban?
Yeah.
Maybe not through USAID, but we are sending money to the Taliban. That's a thing that's happening. We don't need to go down that rabbit hole. $2.2 billion for economic growth programs, including food security, energy, environment, and climate programming. So here's where you start to see some of this lefty stuff. Climate programming, no Republican on earth is going to say, yeah, let's make sure that Nigeria believes that the world is coming to an end in 10 years because of global warming. No Republicans voting for that. So clearly there's a bias here. How far do y'all want me to go? There's a few more significant ones we could get to. Maybe.
Yeah, just focus. I mean, there's the climate action.
So $3 billion to accelerate climate action.
Right. There's also the LGBTQ agenda being pushed in these countries. Those are, I think, two of the big ones that jump out.
Yeah.
All of that under this kind of woke worldview. And irrespective of even if the ones that are good, my big question or the big objection that pops up in my head immediately is, this is U.S. taxpayer money. What business does the United States have in spending U.S. taxpayer money on any of these programs without Congress specifically saying this money goes here, this money goes here? Basically, they've been given a check by Congress, billions of dollars by Congress, and then they get to decide how they want to use it. And what they're using it for is what is why DOGE is doing what it's done, and why so many Americans are upset by what they're hearing, is because we're realizing we're funding all kinds of stuff that is objectionable to a lot of Americans.
Right. And just to Steelman real quick, I think the argument would be, well, we submitted a budget when we asked for the big check, and this stuff was in that budget we submitted. The response would probably be, well, but did anyone actually look at that budget and say you can't have that money because that's ridiculous, or did they just sign the check?
Yeah. I mean, I think what Trump has done with DOGE, in basically all DOGE is doing for the most part, is just a massive audit.
Yeah.
It's opening the books and showing everybody, here's where the money's being spent for. And this is where the objections are starting to come and saying, why are we spending gobs of money on this when we're $36 trillion in debt? I think that's offensive to a lot of Americans.
Yeah, I have the U.S. debt clock pulled up, so I'm just going to read the exact number. We are $36,492,000,000,000, 34 million, and some hundreds of thousands of dollars in debt as of right this moment.
So there has been an objection from the left saying, oh, but that's only like 1% of the total budget. But I don't know if we want to segue to this yet, but I think that issue of the debt is not insignificant. No. But it's less significant than what I think is, and that is weaponizing this against the American people.
Yeah.
Yeah. So that's a good place to go. Just for clarity on that last point, the USAID budget is about $50 billion, which is a lot of money.
Yeah, it's a lot of money, even if it's claimed, oh, it's only 1% of the budget.
Right. I mean, it's more
massive.
It's more than probably the entire city we live in pays in taxes in a year.
Well, let's
definitely more than that.
Let's explain why, even if it's only quote 1% of the budget, why it's so objectionable, even if it were, even 1/10 of 1% of the budget.
Well, and I think that gets to what Andrew was trying to talk about.
Let's kind of go that direction.
Yeah. So when this was created to influence external forces, that's one thing.
Yeah.
But when taxpayer dollars of any quantity are being used to influence the American people, something against their will, that's not their agenda, then that's tyranny, and that is...
Well, it's propaganda for sure.
Yes.
What I would compare it to is it's like... So there are obviously some Americans who want the money spent on these things. Chuck Schumer, I'm sure, is fine with all of this. But we don't want Chuck Schumer to be able to speak with 6,000 voices.
Yeah.
Chuck Schumer gets one voice, just like I get one voice.
Yeah.
He shouldn't be able to take my tax dollars, give them to this organization, USAID, which gives it to somebody else, which gives it to The Atlantic, there's a reason I'm saying The Atlantic, to write a hit piece about how terrible DOGE is, and I have here before me an example of that happening.
Right. I think the word I was looking for actually is treason.
Oh, yeah.
And really it is, because you can't use taxpayer dollars to manipulate the masses. It's just inappropriate.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that one of the organizations created by USAID that was, I think Michael Schellenberger, the investigative journalist, testified to this, was the Organized Crime and Corruption Reporting Project, or OCCRP.
Yeah.
This organization helps promote or report or push in other countries, effectively, supposedly, stories, articles in news with a specific goal in mind to either promote a certain policy or to either elevate or lower elected officials or or to seek regime change, maybe in countries. So it's basically media doing what media does to manipulate the masses into adopting a certain perspective on some issue. Well, what Schellenberger reported is that this organization was involved both in the whistleblower incident that led to the first impeachment of Donald Trump. It was also involved in, according to him, the Russiagate hoax that kind of started the whole claim that Trump was a stooge of Russia. So when you're looking at that, that's what you're talking about. This organization is being weaponized against our own people, so that they are trying to. It's an influence operation, you could say, of the deep state to protect the deep state in its own interest over and against the interests of the American people and the democratic process.
Yeah. Literally funding, I would say, bribing media organizations like Politico.
Right.
Well, certainly, there were lots of subscriptions from the government to Politico, which you can argue whether or not that's funding or not, but $8 million is a lot of subscriptions.
Yeah.
And I guess it wasn't all directly from USAID, but a lot of that went through USAID, I believe.
No, a small fraction was from USAID for those.
Okay.
The point there, though, is I would say it shows they're trying to find the right word for this, the incestuous relationship that has developed within our U.S. government. So you have this group that Washington, and we talk about the Beltway and the Beltway culture and the bureaucratic state. It is more interested in maintaining its own power than it is in representing the American people and what the American people choose.
I just dig in on that real quick. You said it is interested in maintaining its own power, the deep state, the Beltway elite or whatever.
Right.
That's made up of hundreds or thousands or maybe millions of individuals who are interested in maintaining their own paycheck and their own standard of living.
Well, there's that, but you have to understand the nature of Washington is it's the hub of world power. People go to Washington not just because they're looking for a good job necessarily where they'll have a steady income. A lot of people are attracted to Washington because it's the hub of power. They want to influence and change the world, as it were. And so the mechanisms for pulling the levers of power are in Washington.
Yeah.
So if you're in that environment and it has become almost one worldview, or one political kind of perspective has dominated the culture of Washington for so long. When you look at what USAID puts out on its website, which is at best left-leaning, at best, it almost reads like the platform of the Democrat Party.
Just for reference of how dominated the Beltway, Washington, D.C. is by one political party, Kamala Harris, who lost the 2024 election, won Washington, D.C. by 92.5%.
Yeah.
That is a stunning majority.
Yeah. And so for a long time, Washington, D.C. has been Democrat. I mean, that's just how it is. But it's almost like when you're in there living within that bubble, if you're a conservative, like you just pointed out, you are an outlier. You are kind of the I don't know, you're not part of the cool class.
Yeah, you're alone. Like in a room of 10 people, you're the only conservative.
Yeah.
In a room of 100 people, there's only 9 other conservatives. Basically, you're never encountering another conservative to share your thoughts, to feel like, oh, there's people who agree with me on this.
Yeah.
Everyone you meet says, no, you're wrong, you're stupid, you're evil, you're what, blah, blah, blah.
Yeah, it's such a bubble, you could say, that's separated from the rest of the country. And if you haven't experienced the rest of the country, you might find it strange that the rest of the country would think any different from the way you've kind of become oriented in your thinking. And so the other thing too, is concern for budgets and costs. For anybody outside of that Washington bubble, your business, your own budget, it matters if you overspend or not. If you get into debt, your company could be done. You can't let that happen. In Washington, there isn't the concept that, it's almost the reverse. If you receive a budget in Washington for a group, an agency or something, if you don't spend at least what that budget shows, your concern is our budget won't increase next year. So we better spend this money. And so when you have an attitude of more like we have to spend the money versus we need to spend it wisely, you're going to start creating waste because you're more concerned about making sure you maintain your budget and maintain its growth, not, are we being fiscally responsible? Yeah.
Well, to add to that even a little bit, there's also these perverse incentives that all of our Congress people have where it doesn't actually matter if they overspend, if they spend way too much money. If, like, for instance, thinking of when Donald Trump and Joe Biden sent every person in America like $1,000 3 times or something. Everyone likes that. I like it when I get a check for $1,000, but it shot the national debt up, but that doesn't matter if you're a politician because now every one of your constituents is happy with you and is going to vote for you again.
Yeah.
So there's actually an incentive to be reckless with your spending if it's going to make your constituents happy, because then you're going to keep your job.
Yeah.
And so the whole system is crazy. We've kind of drifted from USAID.
Yeah. So I guess back to USAID in regards to the corruption, because I think what USAID is showing, maybe a best way to put this is it's almost a microcosm of the problem in Washington, D.C. Yeah. USAID is just one agency that's not even a big agency, even though it has over 10,000 employees. It's not one of the bigger agencies.
There was also $2 billion for in their budget, $2 billion to revitalize the USAID workforce because 10,000 isn't enough.
Yeah. So it's kind of, the question is, I mean, there's so many elements there. There's mission creep, which is a major problem in Washington. And part of the reason it's a problem is because everybody wants to spend up their money in their budget. And so if you've already done everything you're supposed to do and you still got, we still got, 30 million still here that we could use for something, what can we spend it on? What can we spend it on? There's that. There's that. I mean, that's a very simplistic way of looking at it, but it's kind of what it is. And then then there's always the constant thing of, well, I have an idea that would help change this or solve this problem. And so if we just incorporate this into it, and all of a sudden you're expanding what the original mission of the agency was to do something that might have had nothing to do with, like, what does NASA have to do, for example, with climate change? Isn't NASA supposed to be our space program?
Right.
Why would it be concerned about climate change?
Because one of the things that we've told you about with wokeness is it has to infiltrate everything. Yeah. Everything has to be about these woke issues. Right. Everything has to be about climate change. Everything has to be about trans rights. Everything has to be about whatever the issue of the day is.
Right.
And no organization can free itself of that. Like, that's why you had these, news articles in the past few years talking about how math is racist and stuff. Because everything has to be involved in this. I think, to get on a high horse for a second, the problem we maybe are having here with discussing the specific things USAID is doing wrong is they're so good at lying. And like, even if you look at the website for USAID, it says USAID from the American people. Like, that's their headline of their website. So you're supposed to be thinking, oh, it's charitable giving from the American people. And the image is one of two people shaking hands. And that's not what it's actually about, but they're so good at lying about this stuff. So they'll, put down in a budget, $200,000 for integrated reality exposure, which is video games, we're spending $200,000 on video games. So we're putting it down in the budget. And there's all this evidence that is happening, but it's really tough to lay out the whole causal chain where you go from, there's something we suspect, and I guess we maybe can't say this as a fact, but it seems likely that USAID funded the people who ended up writing about the whole Gamergate kerfuffle more than a decade ago.
Yeah. I think one individual is Anita Sarkeesian. She did Feminist Frequency. If I recall, I think we can say with authority that it was still being paid for, even last year.
Wow.
$200,000.
Wow.
Yeah.
And they were just paying her YouTube video blog where she just talked about feminist stuff and mainly feminist pop culture things. And, this gets more into where it's really relevant to our show because of these sorts of things where it was directly funding influencers who were talking about things like feminism or LGBTQ issues. And there is evidence of this that were, in the example of the Feminist Frequency, it didn't actually have the biggest views out there. It wasn't like some major big blog or YouTube channel, but it was getting paid.
Well, to that point, and that's the big thing, in a marketplace, in a free market, the marketplace rewards the ideas that are most popular, and those ideas that aren't gonna rise because they're just not, people aren't interested in them or they have a problem with them, so they're not going to them. So in that kind of a situation where you have the marketplace and people's liberty determining what they're going to watch or what they're going to listen to and what they're going to agree with and disagree with, you're having an entity with the power of government put its thumb on the scale because it has certain views that it wants to promote and propagate, irrespective of whether or not the public is accepting of it.
And that's totally understandable, right? Like if you are one of these Beltway people and there's a popular idea in the Beltway, we've established that if you're in the Beltway, you're probably only encountering people who believe most of these things. 92% voted for Kamala Harris. It's a huge majority. So they're all in agreement on certain issues. If everyone you meet is in agreement on it, it's like, well, why shouldn't the government throw some money towards this idea if it's being, attacked by trolls online or something? You can easily see how
they would justify it.
They would justify it, even someone who isn't thinking, "Wahahaha, I'm corrupt, I'm going to get my way."
Yeah, but it also exposes the fact that they don't believe in liberty.
Yeah.
I mean, this is why free speech has been under attack, not just over in Europe, but in the United States, and even why our government, that we learned from the Twitter files, was seeking to suppress people's free speech online because it had a narrative that it wanted to make, quote, authoritative. This is what you're allowed to believe. And it didn't like the idea that people might object to it and have other ideas and maybe even better ideas.
Yeah.
It said, this is what we want. This is how we're going to build our policy. And we want people accepting this narrative and not questioning it. Yeah. And that is authoritarianism. That's a very definition of it. And we had our government involved in promoting this. And when you see stuff that USAID is involved in, it's basically the same thing. It's putting its thumb on the scale. It's pushing out certain stories. It's trying to influence both foreign and now we've learned domestically the opinions of people to such a degree that it gets its way and it moves a culture a certain direction that it wants.
And that will have tangible influence on the outcome of an election of all sorts of, Senate races, House races, gubernatorial, national races.
Well, but look what it's done to, and back to Gamergate.
Yeah. Should we explain Gamergate for folks who might not know what that is?
Yeah, Thomas, I think you're probably the expert here. On
hardly. Because I'm not a gamer, but what I do understand, from what I understand about Gamergate, is it kind of is similar to the Me Too movement, but for the gaming industry. Not in the same fashion, but in the sense that the notion was gamers historically are young men.
Yep.
Okay. And they still are for the most part.
Yeah.
But what was created was, this is a place where young men continue a misogynistic worldview and it's anti-feminine or anti-feminist is probably better. And all these other things, all these negative stereotypes were associated with it. Some of them you could justify, others I would argue against. Into this kind of gaming development world, an article or a charge was raised that the gaming industry is basically corrupt.
I think I have it here.
Yeah, why don't you read it?
So August 2014, the controversy began when Eran Gajoni, no idea if I said that right, an ex-boyfriend of Zoe Quinn, published the Zoe Post, a lengthy blog detailing their relationship and accusing her, Quinn, of trading sexual favors for positive game reviews. And so I guess the spin came from, this guy is leveling this accusation. All gamers are misogynist. And then it kind of became this big thing where it's like, we have to eradicate misogyny and the male gaze from video games, which is the male gaze is, to reference someone most people will probably understand, Tomb Raider, Lara Croft in Tomb Raider, who, if you played the older games, was like 16-bit, but famously had very big triangular boobs.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
And that's the male gaze in video games. And that's kind of been the outcome of Gamergate has been trying to eliminate that kind of stuff where it's, surprisingly enough, teenage guys like looking at attractive women in the video games they're playing. I know that's shocking.
Yeah.
And they've been trying to kind of tell these teenage boys, you don't like that. What you actually like is this ugly, bald person. And that's who you really want to see on screen.
It's the feminist agenda trying to manipulate culture.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I would say this is one of the earliest instances of woke being pushed into a space where there was no reason for it there would have been no way that it would have organically developed, put it that way.
And it was funded by the federal government.
That is the picture that is emerging now, is that it was funded by the federal government. Details will become more clear.
Yeah.
But, I was a gamer at the time this happened, but I didn't pay attention to this because I was like, this is stupid. You know, I don't care about this. Just give me the video game, which is, I think, how a lot of gamers felt. And that's maybe why they were able to actually win this fight with the game reviewing websites and with the game developing companies, because they couldn't ignore it because accusations were being leveled about them, and the gamers just didn't care to intervene.
They just want to play their games.
Right.
Yeah. It wasn't until now, is there any kind of a woke backlash to the wokeness within some of these games now?
There's two examples right now. There were a few video games I mentioned that completely flopped last year, and they were very woke. But this year, there is a new Assassin's Creed game coming out set in medieval Japan, or whatever era Japan. I'm bad with Japanese history. But a Japanese setting for Assassin's Creed has been something people have been frothing at the mouth over for 15 years at least.
It's probably like the Shogun era or something.
Yeah.
Ninjas,
right,
and samurai.
And the big controversy is the main character, the character they tried to pitch as, you know, this is who you play as. And now they're backtracking as quickly as they can. But they tried to pitch the game in medieval Japan with a black samurai.
Say what?
And it is based on a black servant in Japan at the time. Like, the name and the face come from this historical figure. Okay. But he was not a samurai. He was a servant of samurai. And they're trying to make a whole game about him being a samurai in medieval Japan. And they're like, we just want to play as a Japanese samurai doing samurai things.
Yeah.
And so now the studio is backing down and being like, you don't even have to play as him if you don't want to. You can play as the girl, and you don't even have to look at him if you don't want to. And it's not going over well. I'll be surprised if this game ends up being successful.
Yeah, but just that, your description of those things, well, what is motivating that kind of ideology to be promoted in, like you just said, this is supposed to be maybe even pre-imperial Japan era. Yeah. Pre-imperial. So the Shogun era, where
it's set, I don't know exactly when, but it's set right at the beginning of interaction with the West.
Yeah. So the Shogun era.
Yeah.
Yeah. How Japan was famously kind of isolationistic at this point, was it not?
Yeah. Yes. Yeah. So that's what people are like, you couldn't just give us a bunch of Japanese people? Isn't that diversity? Like, I guess in video games, it's not, because there's too many video games set in Japan already. So maybe that was the problem the studio ran into, because they got to have diversity.
Well, it used to be that all the video games were created in Japan.
Right. That's what I'm saying. Yeah.
Was this one created in Japan as well?
I think this is Ubisoft, and they're global, but I think they're based out of Canada, which is not a surprise.
No, not at all. I could have guessed that.
America's 51st state.
Right. Yes. Yeah. Soon to be. French developer, but I guess they work in Quebec as well, because I know they have a base in Montreal.
Okay.
Or they did at one point. Don't quote me on that. Maybe I'm wrong.
Canceled.
There's another video game as well that there was a controversy. I think I'm not going to say the name because I'll get it wrong. But the controversy was that there was a unskippable gay sex scene. Oh, turns out that's not true.
Okay.
There is a gay sex scene, but you have to like seek it out. And if you don't, then you're not going to find it. And it's like,
why is that even in there?
Yeah. Why is that even in there is a very good question.
Yeah.
But yeah, anyhow, there has been for years a large woke influence on video games, and it seems like it's getting more backlash now.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so for so long, and part of the reason why we started this podcast is because we've seen these trends in media, and we know that they have an influence on our culture.
Yeah.
And as we have said, politics is downstream of culture. Now we're seeing it is vice versa in so many ways. And in this case, it is politics is upstream of culture. Whereas, and I think Ben Shapiro talked about this recently, a paraphrase of that, what I just said, where we're finding out that these ideas are not just organic shifts in the cultural body. It's not just people are changing their minds about how they view the world.
Yeah.
It is an agenda. It has money behind it. It has power behind it.
It has your money behind it.
Taxpayer money. Yes. And it is a leviathan that is underneath everyone's feet. And it has just been brought to the surface by, I would say, some pretty brave individuals. Because I really do think that for whatever reason, you can argue the motivations for Trump and Elon, whether they're noble or self-serving. You can argue those. But whatever the case, I believe they've taken their own lives into their own hands insofar as if they don't fully eradicate this monster, it will kill them.
Yeah.
Because it is dangerous.
It is dangerous.
Talk about the levers of power, Thomas.
Yeah. Right.
I mean, that's ultimately what we're dealing with here.
Describing a Leviathan that's being brought to the surface is, I think, a very good metaphor here. And it's part of why there's so much difficulty in, so backtracking a little bit. Atlantic, there's an article, I probably won't end up reading it, but it's about this. And it's, detailing how horrible what DOGE is doing is and how USAID was great. And there's several articles from that. And they're from the Atlantic and Washington Post and New York Times and all these people you'd expect. And if you just read those articles, it seems kind of reasonable. It seems like, well, what's happening here? This is dangerous and scary. And it's because this Leviathan has been so deep under the sea for so long that just now we're bringing it to the surface, and it's not even on the surface yet. We're seeing like the shadow in the water. And so anyone who's paying attention is like, that shadow wasn't there, or you couldn't see it a minute ago, and now you can see it, and you can kind of see the shape, and wow, look at all this stuff that's built on top of it. And the Atlantic and New York Times are like, no, that, pointing out, no, that shadow, they're saying it's a fin. It's not a fin. There's no evidence it's a fin. Look, there's waves above it. You can't tell that's a fin of this Leviathan thing. You don't know. And so they're basically trying to slow roll this and get in the way and obstruct and obfuscate what's going on. And unfortunately, they are very, very good at that.
Yeah. I mean, I think they have successfully been able to beat back reform and exposure time and time and time again when it's been tried. This time it's interesting because the weapon that DOGE has rolled out is something I think they didn't know existed and has exposed at a rate and made the connections of basically what DOGE is doing is following the money to be, that old acronym.
That's how they started.
Yeah. And what it's showing is very rapidly all the interconnectedness of everything involved in this, where the money's going and basically what the money's going for. And so when you're able to start seeing that, you're starting to realize the bigger picture of what, like you said, this Leviathan is. And I think a lot of conservatives have long known that the U.S. government is a bureaucratic state that's basically exists to fulfill its own agenda, irrespective of what the American people may elect officials for and who these bureaucrats are hired, what they're hired to do. The trouble is there's always people who are doing the right thing in all these agencies. They got their job. This is what they're doing. They're doing their job faithfully. I mean, if your job in USAID was to make sure that, life-saving drugs get to people in Uganda or something like that, and you're doing your utmost to do it, and that's what you've always known USAID is doing, you're like, well, what are they doing to this organization? That's what we've been doing. Yeah,
you're going to come out and speak and like, it's wrong that they're going after USAID. And from your perspective, you're telling the truth.
Yeah. And so that's why it's always been a challenge, because the apparatus of that like sets the narrative surrounding all this stuff has been so good and been under so many different layers that it looks like, oh, independent media is just going out and doing their research and doing their stories, and this is what they're seeing. And now when you start seeing independent media is not actually independent at all, but a faction of this whole organization that's sent out to make sure, hey, this is the narrative we want out. And we've all seen the videos of like every news media organization literally verbatim saying the same thing about some news story. You start to go, wait a second.
Yeah, the phrase right now, it's constitutional crisis, which is, as far as I can tell, they wholly co-opted that from the UK. I don't think anyone in America had ever said constitutional crisis before 2 weeks ago. And now any left-leaning organization is going to be talking about the constitutional crisis in America right now surrounding DOGE and all this stuff.
Yes, the bureaucratic crisis.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The deep state crisis.
Right. Yeah. The interesting thing you were saying about how, they're writing these articles and it seemed like, oh, independent media is just defending this independently. There's some people on Twitter now who one of them I follow is called Data Republican. And anytime there's one of these articles, she responds with, here's who the author is. Here's, the money they've gotten from the government. Here's the evidence of that. Here's, the programs that would incentivize her to write the thing she's writing right now. And it's really fascinating. It's pretty deep in the weeds. You have to kind of be technical, kind of analytical to be able to follow some of these arguments. But the shape is this giant Leviathan.
Yeah.
And so it's easier to communicate, hey guys, there's a giant Leviathan that's being pulled out of the swamp than it is to communicate, here's how we know it's a giant Leviathan.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But, it's important to state that we do have evidence that we know, and you can find examples like is Tech Republican.
Data Republican.
Data Republican, expressing these are the detailed reasons, and this is the money trail.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, transparency is so important here.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, there have been good laws passed to uphold transparency. And in fact, there's the whole IG apparatus is supposed to be about making sure each agency has an independent within it. What is the AG? The IG.
Investigator General? Is that it?
No.
Inspector General.
Inspector General, which is its job is to try to make sure that, this level of corruption is exposed or dealt with or something like that. But even the IGs can get corrupted, and the system, if there's enough layers put on things, it confuses people or it makes plausible deniability, which I think is a big term. If you can have enough plausible deniability that you can parade out and obfuscate any of the connections, then you can say, well, I'm just doing my job, or this is what we're called to do. And I don't see what's going on here. I don't see the corruption.
There's a lot of blind eyes that have been turned for decades.
Right. And so when you can actually make all the connections suddenly, and you can make it to the point where you can't obfuscate, then that's why all the howls are happening right now, I would argue, from especially the Democrats and members of the bureaucratic class, is because if it was just a normal audit where we're just looking at, here are the books, here's how the money's being spent, everybody who cares about corruption should be like, yeah, we need to do this. So the question, the obvious, why are they objecting is the big thing that I see as telling, because they're screaming and hollering constitutional crisis. It's the executive branch doing an audit on itself.
Of the executive branch, yeah. Like, surely the leader of the executive branch, Donald Trump, should be in charge of where the money the executive branch spends goes. Like, surely that is part of being the leader of the executive
And
branch.
I would think Congress would be all in favor of it, because Congress has passed the laws and Congress holds the purse strings, and Congress is the one that's giving the executive branch the money to enforce these laws that it's passed. And it would probably like a report on, is the executive branch actually spending the money the way we have told them to spend the money?
Yeah. And what exactly have we been telling them to spend the money on unofficially for decades? Going back to the inspector generals, you were bringing up how, they're not seeing some of this corruption.
Yeah.
The age-old phrase is who watches the watchman, which in Latin is quis custodiet ipsos custodes, who watches the watchman. And I think that point, it's recursive, right?
Yeah.
Who watches the watchman? Well, we'll hire watchmen to watch the watchmen. And then, we got to hire watchmen to watch those watchmen who watch the watchmen.
Yeah.
And I think the answer is every generation or so, you have to try again, because whatever the previous mechanism is going to be liable to corruption, which is this generation's attempt to audit, to see where the money is going. Hey, we don't really want to spend it on $500,000 to promote atheism in Nepal.
Yeah.
Yeah. How do you fight entropy? Because that's, right?
Yeah.
Once something goes, you have to disrupt it, because once it's got itself, in that state, entropy is achieved, it's not going to change.
Yeah.
And so you have to have something to step in to disrupt. And that's what DOGE is doing. Disruption is never comfortable. And I'm not sitting here. I mean, some people are like, yeah, people are now losing their jobs in government, which they never thought they would do. Yay. And I'm like,
Yay.
I'm not excited necessarily that people are losing their jobs just because they work in the government. There's a lot of people who work in the government and do good work.
Yeah.
And so just celebrating the fact that people are losing their jobs in government is the wrong attitude. What the attitude needs to be is, we have a government that's lost its way in a lot of ways. There's clearly corrupt elements here that need to be addressed. And in order to do that, we have to open the books. We have to see where everything's going. And there are people who are not doing their jobs, who are just freeloaders, who need to be gotten rid of, or people who are intentionally misusing their position to promote an agenda over and against what the American people want or voted for.
Right.
And so that's what this is about, and that's why this needs to happen. It's not we want people to lose their jobs just because they're in government.
Well, okay. You're right. Like everything you said is completely right. I cannot assail it. Nonetheless, when, it's announced that 200,000 government workers are going to lose their jobs, my reaction is, yay. And then I'm like, there's probably some good people who lost their jobs, and that sucks, and I'm sorry for you. Nonetheless, the balance is good. Like there's goods and bads to 200,000 government workers losing their jobs. I think the good far outweighs the bad. That's my attitude, personally. Sterling is saying that.
Well, Sterling is, you're a libertarian.
At heart.
At heart, I guess you could say. And so, you have the government that governs the least governs the best is your motto, I would say.
Yes. I have come around. I think at this point, I conservatives, as far as I can actively identify myself. I can't say libertarian because they kicked me out. But that is my tendency is libertarian. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, selfishly, all of us wish there was no such thing as government and that everyone just got along.
Yeah.
That would be nice. Impossible,
though.
Yes, unfortunately. All right. Well, we talked an awful lot about USAID and about kind of the Leviathan, as we've coined the term, as Andrew coined the term, that USAID is kind of the tip of the spear of. There's more that we wanted to get to.
Yeah,
there's
a lot.
USAID is involved in some like intelligence operations that you'd expect from the CIA. And, it's like, what's going on with that? That's pretty weird. We're not going to be able to get to all that. We've been going pretty far already.
Yeah.
Y'all got anything else that's relevant to what we have talked about today that needs to be included?
From the pop culture point, I think we kind of made it with what this is being used to influence our own culture, not just political culture, but even our value system. I think is what I find highly offensive.
Yeah. Sure.
Yeah.
One just interesting aside, there's a guy, Andrew Bustamante, who does this. He's an ex-CIA guy who some people would say is a psyop, but is on YouTube, and he does like this spy training thing, and he's been on all the podcasts. He talked about recruiting for the CIA. If you're recruited to the CIA, you can never work for the Peace Corps. And if you work for the Peace Corps, you can never be recruited for the CIA because of that conflict of interest.
Yeah.
And I find it such an offense that USAID is
effectively that conflict of
interest.
Yeah. So I think I've heard this statement from this guy before, and the idea is you can't have the CIA infiltrating the Peace Corps because you want the Peace Corps to be able to do its job. You want them to show up to war-torn Somalia and provide help, and no one's trying to kill them because they might be a CIA agent.
Right.
Okay. Yeah.
Yeah. And another thing about the CIA is it's never allowed to operate on the American people.
Yeah, right. Yeah, right.
Supposedly.
That law is not worth the paper it's written on.
Anyway.
What's your evidence, Sterling?
Yeah.
It's a covert organization. They don't leave evidence. All right. I think that's a funny line to end it on.
Yes, indeed.
This has been the Pop Culture Contrarian with Thomas, Sterling, and Andrew. I am the crazy person, Sterling, who said the crazy things this episode, not them. Don't blame them. We're brought to you by the Patriot Post, which is the oldest conservative news digest on the web. It's right and it's free. Be sure to like and subscribe, and we'll talk to you next time. Bye.
Bye.
See you guys.